Ever ponder what may occur if the flowers we grow could reveal sinister truths about the future? Imagine if every bloom had a warning or message that, if disregarded, could result in catastrophe. This is the story of Samuel, a municipal gardener in the city's Central Park, who devoted his life to preserving the natural beauty that surrounded tourists. However, Samuel never imagined that his passion for gardening would bring him to the depths of a terrifying reality. It all started one day when he noticed a new flower arrangement in a forgotten corner of the park. The flowers appeared to be arranged in an unexplainable way, creating symmetrical patterns that, upon closer inspection, revealed unsettling silhouettes. At first, he assumed it was a trick of light and shadow, but as the days went by, these patterns started to materialize in real life, foretelling tragic events that would mark the city. For more than 10 years, Samuel had been employed at the park, where he was constantly surrounded by people laughing, kids playing, and families spending a day outside. But when the first tragedy started to happen, the peace was broken. An automobile accident happened a few streets from the park the day after a group of visitors took selfies near to some flowers that looked like wings, injuring multiple people. Even after planting those flowers, Samuel couldn't get rid of the thought that something deeper was causing these regrettable occurrences. He initially attempted to voice his worries to his co-workers, but the majority of them scoffed at him and brushed him off. However, reality took a darker turn when a floral pattern shaped like a broken heart prophesied the terrible end of a well-known relationship in the neighborhood. No one thought that the flowers could have any meaning beyond their beauty. 3 persons were killed when the Old Town Bridge collapsed the next week. As the city entered a cycle of bad luck, every incident appeared to follow the patterns left by the flowers. Samuel's obsession with the patterns grew as he began to understand that each flower served as a warning and an emotional mirror, linking nature to human sorrow. In his mind, his love of gardening became a battle to comprehend what was going on before it was too late. But if no one listened, there was nothing he could do. While the patterns became more obvious, his distress increased until one day, while he was planting a succession of lies, he noticed that they formed a zigzag line, and a gloomy feeling overcame him. He remembered seeing the same pattern in an old town tradition about flowers being bad luck bearers. Samuel made the decision that he had to take action in order to try to stop the next tragedy from happening, since he could not keep ignoring what was going on. Heading to the mayor's office, he felt a knot in his stomach. In an attempt to persuade him that the floral patterns were portending disasters, he cautiously presented his theory. Naturally, the mayor thought Samuel was insane. The authorities ignored the frantic gardener's foolishness because they were too preoccupied with the current issue. Samuel made the decision to act independently and committed himself to studying the city's past in order to find any evidence that would lend credence to his theory. As his investigation went on, Samuel discovered that the patterns the flowers created matched old tales of calamity that had happened in the past. He understood that he was not insane. There was a connection between the beauty of nature and human misery. But when his fixation caused him to lose touch with reality, Samuel withdrew and allowed his social life to fall apart while he focused on his studies. The park's laughing and the commotion of everyday life faded into the background. Every flower he planted seemed to convey deadly secrets, echoing the loneliness that drove him to dark regions in his thoughts. He was looking at the garden one night in the moonlight when he saw a pattern that made his blood freeze. The flowers were constructing a figure that looked like a gravestone. He fled home in terror, but the vision was seared indelibly in his mind. He was awake at night, thinking that a fresh catastrophe was on the horizon. Samuel made the decision to get together with his close pals who used to enjoy his company and work in the park. Their faces were laced with doubt as he explained the patterns and their cautions that each bloom appeared to be intended to avert calamities. Laura, a friend, gave him a worried look and said he needed expert assistance. After all, Samuel had trusted them to believe him, so he was devastated. But that night, he chose to disregard their remarks. It was as if the bloom turned against him. The air was heavy with an unexplained tension by daybreak, and his heart pounded with excitement for what he may discover as he got closer to the park. When he arrived, he discovered guests wandering idly amid the flowers he had planted, not realizing that a new pattern had already emerged, a downward spiral that nearly foretold a catastrophe. In an instant, a piercing scream shattered the air as Samuel shouted for the crowd to disperse. A poorly maintained structure had collapsed in the park, taking several innocent lives, including his friend Laura. The image of the flowers in his mind changed into a sea of guilt and pain, and he felt that it was his responsibility that everything he had predicted had come true. Every flower he had planted now served as a continual reminder of his failure, and the sound of laughing changed into quiet. leaving him feeling completely alone and condemned by the warnings that no one followed. Samuel fell into a deep state of sorrow after that day. He dedicated his life to maintaining the park, but he was no longer delighted by the flowers. In an attempt to get rid of the patterns that had hurt him so deeply, he started to uproot them and destroy everything he had made. But as his own deeds came to pass, the tragedy cycle persisted. Samuel was caught in a vicious loop from which he was unable to break free as new flowers appeared and new catastrophes threatened. His beloved park turned into a patchwork of memories and ignored cautions. Samuel's tale eventually turned into an urban legend. The gardener who had lost the meaning of his work was the subject of whispers. As the flowers bloomed and wilted, the park lost its allure to tourists and became a symbol of tragedy. As Samuel tried to untangle, his heart grew heavier. In his mind, a sea of unsolved questions consumed him. Could he have done something differently? Was there any way to avoid the fate that the flowers had foreseen? In the end, the patterns in the flowers continued to exist, invisible to most, and Samuel was stuck between the beauty of his art and the darkness of his reality. The mystery of the patterns, he had lost his way, his purpose, and most painfully, those he loved most. The sadness of his story lingers in the air like a bitter perfume that finds its way into the hearts of those who pass through the park, reminding us that sometimes what seems beautiful can hide a deep horror. The next one. Libraries have always seemed like magical places to me. There is an old library in my city that seems like it belongs in a scary movie. The air is dusty, the halls are dim, and the shelves are creaking under the weight of innumerable books. I started working as a librarian there. The thousands of stories that were written in those pages dominated my life. But I never dreamed that some of those stories would become so real that they turned into ominous prophecies. It all began one typical evening when a strong storm knocked out the electricity. I ended myself searching through some books that had been stored in the dark for decades in the old book part in the basement. I heard a whisper at that moment. As I got closer to one of the shelves, I noticed a book, but I assumed it was simply my nerves after a hard day of work. Intrigued, I opened it, moving a little as though an unseen breeze were pushing it, and discovered that the pages were chock full of unfamiliar phrases. As the storm raged outside that night, they seemed to be rewriting themselves. I was unable to look away from that book. The words formed stories of tragedies and deaths as they danced in front of me. I never thought that those pages may contain tales of neighbors I knew who lived a few houses away and whose fates seemed predetermined. I initially believed it to be a trick of my weary brain, but as the hours went by and the invisible typewriter kept working, the atmosphere surrounding me became more sinister and heavy. I saw that the names of the people who perished in the stories were the same ones that I saw in my daily life as I started to remember them. A shiver went down my spine and my heart began to accelerate. What would occur if such tales came to pass? I was overcome with panic, but I was also driven to continue reading by an unquenchable curiosity. Every page was an epiphany, a window into an unavoidable future. These stories were written by whom? How could they have known such personal information about us? I kept thinking about those novels for days on end. I had the impression that the librarian inside of me was becoming into an oracle. I had to discover fresh tales and newly announced fatalities each time I went into the basement. The words I had read came back to me every time one of my neighbors vanished or experienced a tragedy. The ongoing anxiety hung over my head like a shadow I couldn't get rid of. Once my haven, the library turned to become a terrifying place. As I shared accounts of what I had found, my coworkers started to detect that something was amiss and observed me with concern. Others looked at me with a level of fear that made me uneasy, while others laughed, believing I was exaggerating. Every time I switched on the lights in the basement, the darkness deepened. The basement librarian was turning into a character in her own tale. While going through the old books a week later, I came across one that didn't look quite right. The title was hardly readable, and the cover was worn. The Shadows That Walk had spoken, and when I opened it, I shuddered. They had already written the first page. As the sentences unfolded before me, I feared to confess that it was one of the stories I had read previously. A story about the death of a woman named Emily, whom I had seen in the corner cafe only days before. That same evening, Emily would lose her life in a car accident. Dark visions raced through my head, and I knew deep down that I had to do something, that I had to stop that from happening somehow. I plucked up the strength to go look for Emily. The atmosphere was heavy with a sense of gloom, and the air was dense. I tried to recall her features as I hurried to the cafe. She was sat at one of the tables when I arrived, oblivious to the approaching storm. I walked over to her and tried to warn her about what I had read, but the words stayed in my throat like an unseen hand was holding me back. All I could manage was a string of unintelligible words before she gave me a kind smile, thinking it was a horrible joke. Emily said farewell and motioned for me to cease dramatizing before I could respond. Her smile vanished as she crossed the street. It was a moment, a whisper of destiny. A trumpet sounded in my ears and a dazzling light came rapidly closer. The hit was violent, time appeared to stop, and everything happened in an instant. As reality fell apart all around me, I sobbed in silence. The story I thought I could alter had come to pass, and the horror of what I had read became real. With my temples pulsating like a drum, I hurried back to the library in an attempt to find comfort in the books that had predicted this disaster. However, my haven had become a maze of unceasing whispers and shadows. Once more, the book's pages rewrote itself, and now the names of my co-workers started to show up in the stories that followed. Desperate, I made the decision that I had to find out the truth about that terrible library. I could not stay there. In search of solutions, I lost myself in the books. I devoted numerous evenings to learning about the building's past, its previous occupants, and the myths that frequently surrounded it. The elders of the community told me stories in whispers about a librarian who had struck a sinister alliance with mystical forces. They told me of novels that ought never to have been read, tales that drew strength from human misery and, once exposed, came to life. After learning more about those sinister gifts, I started to make the connections and realized that I was more than just a basement librarian. I was a keeper of secrets that ought to have stayed buried. I understood that facing the force that had seized control of the books was the only way to lift the curse. Returning to the basement, I had to confront the shadow that had. The stories were rewritten, so one evening, I went back to where it all began with a lantern and the will to overcome that burden. The library was quiet, and the bookshelves appeared to be mocking me, but I knew I had to continue. As I moved toward the location where I had initially discovered those cursed books, the tension increased with each step, as though the shadows were trying to trap me. I opened book after book, and what had begun as a game of words turned into a confrontational ritual as I repeated passages from the death stories. My body felt a chilling current, and the air became more oppressive. With what little courage I still had, I sensed an encompassing presence, something ancient, observing me. I declared that I no longer dreaded their stories and that they would no longer determine the destiny of the people I cared about. There was a chuckle among the shells in that moment. It was a chilly sound that rang in my ears. The voice asked, "Do you really think you can get out of this? The darkness will always find you." Yet as I spoke, I saw the atmosphere shifting. The presence waned in the face of my will. When I eventually closed the last book, the room burst into a flurry of light and shadow because I could feel the pages tearing and the stories losing their impact. As though the souls imprisoned between the pages might now finally rest, I experienced a sense of relief. Everything became peaceful in an instant, as though a dark element had been removed from the air. The test was passed by me. I had confronted the monster that lived in my own library, but at a heavy cost. I was aware that the library would always have secrets as a warning, even though I had released some. Nevertheless, I felt a mixture of relief and melancholy as I shut the basement door for the last time, since I could finally go back to my life, my house, and my friends, without the fear of death looming around every corner. I was prepared to face whatever lay ahead, even though I knew I would never be the same again. My friends, this story reminds us that shadows might sometimes have darker secrets than we think. I hope this story was enjoyable to you. In the event that you did, please remember to subscribe to the channel for more spine-tingling stories and to like and comment on what you thought. Till the next occasion.